Yes. We were supposed to introduce Ezekiel at the Indian church last week, but things didn't work out. So I'm going to do the introduction to Ezekiel today. That way nobody will have missed anything. Okay, so today is just looking at Ezekiel from the outside. Like I said before we started, that Adventists know next to nothing about Ezekiel. We may know some selected passages, but really not very much. Ezekiel 38 has achieved some new significance in the last month because of the war in Israel. But that is something that Christians do every time there's a war. They try to find a biblical prophecy that attaches to it. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the background materials, because it may help us to better understand the book itself when we begin into the sections next week. There are a couple of things we need to keep in mind when dealing with Ezekiel, because he is kind of unique compared to anybody else in the Old Testament. In the Bible, we have two kinds of stories, parables and allegories. We know all about parables. By definition, a parable is an extended simile. And so Jesus is the one who used the most parables. Matthew and Luke recorded the most parables, but you have them in the Old Testament as well. And parables usually are grounded in reality. So the kingdom of heaven is like a shepherd who had 100 sheep. Kingdom of heaven is like a woman who had 10 coins, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, allegory is defined as extended metaphor, but not grounded in reality. And to the best of my knowledge, apart from Luke 18, only Ezekiel contains full-fledged allegories. In fact, they are full-fledged, the entire chapter. We will have a look at the allegories as a group. And so he is very unusual because allegorical understanding of the Bible was thrown out of the window by the Masoretic scribes who put together the Hebrew Bible. It was also thrown out of the Bible as a method of interpretation by the Protestant movement, but it was adopted full scale by the Roman Catholic Church until modern times. For 1,000 years, allegorical reading of the Bible was the primary hermeneutics of the Western Church. And there are sections of the Bible that even Adventists read allegorically. And so it's good to understand this when we get to the allegories of Ezekiel, to know that it's not grounded in reality. So you cannot draw a straight line, unlike a parable, with reality and with the story itself. You have to do something else. We also need to understand prophecy types, because I fear that a lot of people simply pull a prophecy as long as it's in a prophetic book and it seems to fit some contemporary event and apply it over there. The majority of prophecies in the Bible are what we call classical prophecy. These are prophecies that are contemporaneous with the reality. They are messages from God through the prophet at that moment in time. They do not necessarily have an application for future generations. And since everyone here is an Adventist, you need to be careful when you're reading Spirit of Prophecy books as well, because most of her writing has to do with classical prophetic type. So you cannot necessarily take something from a manuscript of hers and force it to apply to our age today, because it is believed, it's not believed, it was intended to be contemporaneous with something happening at the time. And classical prophecies can only be treated as applying beyond their time frame if the New Testament comes around and takes those prophecies and applies them that way. So, for instance, messianic prophecies, that's how they function. They actually were given in real time and space, applying to a specific situation at that time. But the New Testament comes around and says it can also be applied to the life story of Jesus. Okay, Sanki, please watch if somebody is coming in, if you can let them in.
Yes, I am.
The second group of prophecies, which itself can be divided in two types, is what we call eschatological prophecy. See, classical prophecy deals with contemporaneous reality. Eschatological deals with proleptic reality. The word proleptic basically is something in the future. But over here we have two kinds of eschatological. There is the generic eschatology. So anything that is future to that moment is eschatological. And in the writings of the prophets, the term that is used most often for this kind of prophecy is on that day, in the day of the Lord. And that phrase actually appears in Revelation, and it has been so misapplied by both Sunday keeping Christians and Sabbath keeping Christians. Okay? And then, of course, we have the very special one called apocalyptic. Apocalyptics inevitably refers to events that are so far in the future they're seen as end of the world kind of future. So some of Daniel's prophecies belong to this genre. Most of Revelation belongs to this genre. There are some prophecies in Isaiah from 24 to 27 chapters that belong to this genre of prophecy and so on. The problem with Ezekiel is that it contains all three prophecies: classical, generic eschatology, and apocalyptic. And this makes interpreting Ezekiel a little difficult because each of these types of prophecies sort of requires a slightly different set of rules for interpretation. You know, Christians often try to treat biblical prophecies as one big lump sum and you apply the same set of rules across the board with everything. That really doesn't work. And we get ourselves into difficulties because 100 years down the road, somebody else comes around and sees a different understanding of that prophecy, and we go back and forth all the time. And so the early Christians were able to apply a lot of Old Testament prophecies to Jesus. The Jews could not. And so they're still waiting for the Messiah. I was watching a YouTube presentation about the origins of Islam, particularly of the Quran, and something jumped at me that I must have noticed when I read the Quran in the past, but never paid attention to it, that the name Isas, which is Arabic for Jesus, appears more often in the Quran than the name Muhammad. In fact, Muhammad only appears 3 times, something like that. The author said, I need to go back and double check. And what he was trying to show is that many of the things that you have in the Quran actually came through a process of development, just like the Bible books. Of course, Muslims no longer accept that, but the so-called Quran, the Golden Book theory, did not actually appear in Muslim writings until the 9th century, I think like 250 years later. And so understanding or knowing how to interpret the Bible properly becomes important, because you cannot interpret apocalyptics, which is heavily dependent on symbols, the same way as classical, which is non-symbolic, unless the author is showing you that he's using something at that moment, but clearly looking at something way beyond that point in time. Now, when it comes to dating the book, surprisingly, this is one of the easier books of the Old Testament among the prophets in terms of dating. We know that Ezekiel found himself in Babylon with the very first deportation in 597 BC. Nebuchadnezzar invaded the land in 597, and he deported a bunch of people to Babylon. He did not yet conquer Jerusalem or destroy the temple at that point in time. He tells us that God called him to be a prophet. He doesn't actually use the term prophet. The book uses the term watchman. God called him to be a watchman in the 5th year of his stay in Babylon. So that would be 592 BC. This would be roughly about the time that Buddhism was appearing on the eastern horizon. His ministry lasted about 22 years. It ended around 571. We don't know if he stopped being a prophet or he died that year. Most probably he died, or maybe he was too old by then. And this was in his 27th year being in Babylon. So he was in Babylon for a long time. In fact, he was in Babylon more than he had been in Judah. Kind of like me. I'm Indian, but I've been out of India much, much longer than I was in India. In fact, twice as long. And so we have to be careful because you cannot put Daniel and Ezekiel in more or less the same breath. It's a little different timeline. What was happening at this point in history? Of course, the so-called fall of Jerusalem, the Babylonian invasion in 586 BC. Most of the Jews that Nebuchadnezzar thought were beneficial to him, the young, the educated, the well-to-do, he deported them, huge numbers, to Babylon. He left behind the poor, the elderly. And Jeremiah was an old prophet at this time, so Jeremiah did not get deported. And people from the lower ranks of society. And most of those people ran off to Egypt. And so during this period, we would develop two centers of Judaism, one in Babylon in the east and one in the south in Elephantine Island on the Nile in Egypt. Jeremiah would be in Egypt. He was forced by the Jews to go with him, to go with them to Egypt. Ezekiel and Daniel would end up in Babylon. Now, he would have seen the bulk of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. This is Nebuchadnezzar the Great, Nebuchadnezzar II, who was king of Babylon from 605 to 562. So just a small gap between the end of Ezekiel's ministry and the end of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. But Daniel would live beyond that point. And then, of course, we have him being a contemporary of Daniel, but an older contemporary, because he was not at the same time as Daniel. He was there much before Daniel. Daniel came as a very young man. Ezekiel was not a young man when he went there. And so a little bit different timeline. There's a lot of debate in scholarly material whether there was any kind of contact between these two. My leaning is probably very little or almost none, simply because Daniel, as one of those selected to serve Nebuchadnezzar, their lives would have been confined to their government buildings, as you would call them today. They had special quarters for them to live. They were in that school or teaching in that school. They were serving the king in the palace. And so Daniel probably had minimal contact with the Jews who lived away outside of the city of Babylon itself, in like the suburbs area. We know quite a bit about his life. First of all, he was the son of a priest. We know his father's name, Buzi, which means that if he was still in Jerusalem and the temple was still standing, when he reached 30 years of age, he would start serving as a priest. This is something very interesting about the priesthood of Israel. They were not allowed to minister in the temple until they reached the age of 30, even though they would have been considered fully grown men by the time they were 12 or 13 years old. Now, the sheer number of priests available, as we can read in the listings of Chronicles, would have made this a practical thing. But I think the thinking seems to be that they had to be mature enough. In order to be a priest, you had to be married. And so, younger men may not be married yet, and they have to be settled. Priests could also serve only for 30 years. So at 60, he would have to retire. He would be considered too old to minister properly to God. In other words, a priest can only serve God in the temple during the prime of his life, not those developmental years and not those old age years. But he was 25 years old when he was taken to Babylon. And about 10 years later, the temple was destroyed. And so he never got to be a priest like his father. We don't know if his father was also deported to Babylon. Most probably not, at least not at the same stage, because the temple was still running until the second invasion of Nebuchadnezzar. He tells us that he was married, but about 9 years into the exile, his wife died. But he tells us nothing about his children, whether he had any. So we have no record about that part of his life. There are only two prophets in the Bible who record, well, three of them, sorry, who record having a wife: Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Hosea. Now, I'm sure that most of them would have had wives, but definitely Jeremiah did not, because God did not allow Jeremiah to marry, and Daniel did not, because serving the king in Babylon, the chances are Daniel would have been castrated like most high officers in Nebuchadnezzar's court, so he would have probably been a kind of a eunuch, and so he would not have had a normal family life. Many of the others, like Malachi and Haggai and Nahum and Micah, we don't know, but most probably they were married. It was common for the Jewish people to be married. In fact, most of them probably had more than one wife. Now, among these, Isaiah had a special name for his wife. He never called her by name, he called her prophetess. Now, Ezekiel doesn't give the name of his wife or have a special nickname for her. So we will just refer to her as Mrs. Ezekiel, probably. But she didn't live long. Maybe that whole movement to Babylon was not good on her health. Now he tells us where he lived. Now, do you see something familiar about the name? This is where the modern city of Tel Aviv derived its name from. In terms of Hebrew lettering, it's exactly the same letters. The word Tel is a Sumerian word which means a kind of a hill, a man-made hill. Babylon was all flat land, and so Nebuchadnezzar built these artificial hills all around. And later on, when the cities were covered over, they became hills, and archaeologists would call them tells. So when you're reading biblical archaeology, place names are mentioned as tell this, tell that. So this is Tel Aviv, or in modern pronunciation, Tel Aviv. The number one city in modern day Israel derived its name from the number one place where the captivity or the Judean exiles lived. Now this, excuse me, this was outside Babylon, in the outskirts of Babylon, and the river Kebar was not a natural river. It's more like the Klongs here in Thailand. This was one of the waterways that the Babylonians built. The Babylonian built canals, Klongs all over the place. Became a river-based culture because the Euphrates was a huge river. It was also a way of controlling irrigation and flooding, kind of like Thailand is doing. That's what Thailand does with these Klongs: control irrigation, control water flow, control flooding. Okay, so this name is an important name in today's world, Tel Aviv. It's a river town. Think of it like living along the Chao Phraya River or some place like that. So Ayutthaya province, okay, would be kind of Tel Aviv for Bangkok. So it would be in some distance from the city, and would have required him some travel. We don't know if the Jews who live in Tel Aviv were actually allowed to go back and forth into the main city of Babylon, but they had their own freedom over there. They were not slaves. They were just not able to go back to Judah. They had to stay in Babylon. And Jeremiah had written a letter to them telling them to settle down, grow in numbers, grow in strength, prosper. Don't waste your time in Babylon. God knows the plans He has for you, and one day He will bring you home. But in the meantime, you must do your best to make sure that there is peace and prosperity in Babylon, because the two things would be connected to each other. And they did prosper. Population basically tripled during their stay in Babylon. It's only about 100 years. Their love for the Bible or the Torah grew during this period. Life changed a great deal for them. They went to being totally monotheistic during this period as well. And I'm sure that Ezekiel had a hand in this spiritual development of Judah. Now, here's the interesting thing. When he was 30 years old, God called him to ministry. That would be the same year that he would have been serving as a priest if Jerusalem had not been destroyed. And so he started his prophetic ministry at about the same time as he would have started his priestly ministry if history had not changed. He was in Babylon about 10 years before Daniel came. Daniel arrived in Babylon around 586, 587 BC, depending on your dating. That was the second invasion and the total destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. That's when Daniel and his three friends arrived in Babylon. Unlike Daniel, Ezekiel came from the priestly clan, so that's very high rank. Daniel and his friends came from the aristocracy. So here are two prophets in Babylon who came from the high echelons of Judah society, the priests and the aristocracy. In Babylon, Judah did not have your lower level prophets like they did in Judah, people who came from normal walks of life, or from like Amos being a businessman or a farmer. And so these two main prophets of the captivity period, they came from the highest levels of society. And I think there's a reason for this. Daniel, coming from the aristocracy and having to work with the high powers in the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar, he would be a natural fit in that world. He is from the royal family of Judah. He knows the protocols. He understands what it means to live with that high politics. Being a priest, Ezekiel would have been cherished by his people since they no longer had the temple. So at least knowing there's a priest and a prophet among them would make them feel connected a little bit to that temple that was destroyed. Okay, a little bit about the book. Interestingly, while there's so much debate about Daniel, about Isaiah, and about the minor prophets, there's minimum debate about Ezekiel. Even the most critical scholars are in sort of a consensus that this book is genuine, as it stands, is as it was probably written, and probably at the time by this prophet. Isaiah got torn up into three pieces from different times of history and so on. None of that happened to Ezekiel. But the book has unusual elements that you don't find anywhere else, symbolic as well as enactments. One of the unusual things in the book is that God kept asking Ezekiel to do some crazy stunts, things that we would consider a mad person in our world doing. And we shall be looking at some of these. If Ezekiel lived in our world and did some of the things God asked him to do, he would have been put in a mental institution, a mental hospital, or some place like that, because he would have been seen as really off his head, off his brains, or simply insane or mad, or absolutely eccentric. Like I said earlier, it contains several allegories. So again, that's very unusual because it's not like the other prophet books, which basically do not contain allegories. It records these many strange acts by the prophet himself, and some of them just don't make sense. One of the funny ones, I'm sure everybody would have had a good laugh about it. God asked him to shave his head and his beard from one side. So one side, everything is shaven. The other side is full, the Jews, full bearded and full hair. And then walk around the city like that for a number of days until it all grew back. How long would it take for it all grow back? How would he have looked? Imagine if there was social media and somebody caught a video of Ezekiel half shaved walking around the city. It would have gone viral every single day of the week. So his life was not easy in that sense. Maybe it stressed his wife out a lot, watching her husband and maybe people making fun of him as well. Unlike most prophet books, but similar to Daniel's, it was written mostly in prose. See, Ezekiel is almost 90% poetry, so is Jeremiah, the minor prophets. Daniel and Ezekiel, for some reason, have more prose than poetry in them. Poetry is the common mode of writing for the prophet books, okay? But it doesn't really apply to Ezekiel and to Daniel. And so we need to keep that in mind, that we also have to figure out the difference between the prose sections and the poetry sections, because the rules for interpreting poetry in Hebrew are very different from interpreting non-poetic writings or prose writings or narratives. If you're learning Hebrew, if you ever decide to learn Hebrew, you'll probably never touch Ezekiel along the way, because the Hebrew in Ezekiel is rather obscure and difficult. And it seems to be more in line with the Hebrew of that age. So it's a little bit archaic versus the later Hebrew that would appear in the Masoretic text that is now the standard Hebrew Bible. So it's a challenging book. And maybe these are some of the reasons why Adventists haven't paid much attention. Very few sermons have ever arisen out of Ezekiel, very few Bible studies. While we have Daniel seminars, Revelation seminars, even Isaiah seminars, I don't think, even I've never done a full Ezekiel seminar. It's a difficult book to handle in that sense. Okay. The book has more symbolism, even more than Daniel, than any other prophet book in the Old Testament. The only competition in the Bible is Revelation. But as we will see as we go along, there's a reason for this. So the book is full of symbols because he has so many apocalyptic prophecies. And that challenges us because symbols are not meant to be understood literally, whether it's a color, a number, a name, or whatever. Therefore, we have to figure out how to really understand it. What is it? Think of it like a code. It's a code for one. Okay. But unlike most other books, especially prophet books, Ezekiel has a very clear chronological sequence. He tells us, that's how we know the 5th year he was in Babylon, the 25th year he was there, the 9th year his wife died. He dates himself. The only other Bible writer who is meticulous like this is Luke. Luke would do the same thing, dating events to the year that Quirinius was the governor of Syria, or Augustus Caesar was the emperor of Rome, and so on and so forth. So Ezekiel must have been a very careful writer. Now, coming from a priestly family, they were highly, highly educated, probably the best educated people in the land. So maybe he had a skill for writing. That's why the Hebrew is so difficult, but also this this care for details that we see in the book. Something else about the book, he tells more about how inspiration actually works than any other prophet book. He actually describes what the Spirit of God does to him physically and how that impacted him and his message. For Ezekiel, inspiration is not just God giving you some fancy thoughts to write about. It is actually God doing things to you physically, like carrying you from place to place. This is a very strange thing. It has led many people to question whether Ezekiel was imagining the whole experience. But if you accept at face value what he's saying, that the Spirit literally carried him from this place to that place, then you have to accept that inspiration is a lot more than just God giving us thoughts, but is God being involved in that prophet's life in a very physical way sometimes. And the book is basically an autobiography. Well, it's written that way. The other prophet books are not written that way. The first half of Daniel is a bit autobiographical, and the first few chapters of Hosea. But the rest of the prophet books, they are not concerned with autobiography. This is why we know so little about most of the prophets, but so much about Ezekiel. So from the point of view of knowing the man, the servant of God, this is the easiest book. We've got a lot of autobiographical material to work with. He is given a special name. We don't know if God actually gave him this name or it was one that he appropriated from something that God may have said. But he suggests that God always referred to him as Son of Man. We have to wait until we get to the Gospel of Mark to recognize this as a messianic designation. Mark would adopt this name from Ezekiel and apply it to Jesus over and over. So Ezekiel is constantly referred to as Son of Man. So God or the Spirit would come to him and say, Son of Man, go and do this. Son of Man, preach this message or whatever. We don't have other prophets adopting special names like this. Okay, so again, a little different book. Here's the thing that most Adventists have never seen. In fact, most Bible students have never seen. Ezekiel is one of the major sources of revelation. And I mean really major. Okay. And so because of that, I'm going to approach our study of Ezekiel in a little different way, and I'll explain that to you as we go along. Ideas, names, symbols, concepts. In fact, you know, the 12 stones that you find in the breastplate of the high priest appears in only 3 places: Exodus, Ezekiel, Revelation. You know, things like that. The description that he has of this futuristic temple and city, it sounds like the New Jerusalem in Revelation. And also the use of the title Son of Man, which is also used for Jesus in Revelation, and the description of angels that we have here replicated in Revelation. It's amazing that Adventists always connect Daniel with Revelation when the intertextual links between Daniel and Revelation are minimal. I mean, really minimal. But the intertextual links between Ezekiel and Revelation, they're just everywhere. And when we enter the book next week, you will see right from the start of Ezekiel, things are jumping into Revelation. John seemed to have studied 2 Old Testament prophets a great deal, Isaiah and and Ezekiel, and then a little bit of Zechariah. If you look at the primary sources, you know, most of us as teachers, we understand about primary research. The primary sources of revelation material comes from these 3 prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah. Daniel is not a primary resource, it's a minor source of material in Revelation. And so this is important. And since we've never done an Ezekiel Revelation seminar, this will be the first time even for me to do this. I did actually sit down a few years back to trace every phrase, every name, every number, every item in Revelation, to trace it back to its sources in the Old Testament. And you'd be amazed at how many times Isaiah and Ezekiel keep popping up in Revelation. So we are going to study Ezekiel with Revelation in the backdrop, because these two books are so heavily linked that it's amazing. We have never seen that linkage before. Okay. The structure of the book is relatively simple. The macro structure, there are just 3 parts to the book. The first 24 chapters deals with the fall of Jerusalem, though it commences with a vision of God and how that impacts the fall of Jerusalem. The center section, 25 to 32, deals with foreign nations, prophecies against the foreign nations. And then the final section, which includes that famous temple vision, deals with the restoration of Israel. So the sequence is very simple. Jerusalem falls, Israel falls, the other nations will be judged by God as well, and then Israel will be restored. This is why there's a renewed interest in this final portion of Ezekiel because of the current war. This is unfortunate. People should be studying the Bible in a broader sense than that. But the chapters dealing or that seem to indicate this current war are found in here in this final section. The biggest headache with studying Ezekiel is this. There is a conundrum in the book that scholars cannot resolve it, the rabbis never resolve it, Christian preachers never resolve it, and maybe why we just ignore the book, because we can't resolve this problem. And that is this. 9 chapters, 40 to 48, contains this detailed description, vision of this future temple and how life is organized around it, the city of the prince, the lands of the people, and so on and so forth. But it never was fulfilled historically. It doesn't fit with the Second Temple period at all. It doesn't fit with the Herod's temple period at all. But there are many elements from it that are used to describe the New Jerusalem in Revelation. And yet there are elements that do not fit Revelation quite as well. And so these chapters have remained a conundrum for biblical research to this day. What is this? Was this a temple that he saw that could have been built if the people had stayed closer to God, but it never happened? Is this a temple that's completely apocalyptic, so way out in the future, maybe fulfilled in Revelation? Is this a temple? A more modern explanation is that this is what must be rebuilt in Jerusalem in order to usher in the kingdom of God. You may not be aware how many Christian groups there are who actually maintain that vision, and some Jewish groups as well, that we need to rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount. And the patterns that they are thinking of is we need to follow what Ezekiel is saying here. And so possibilities, it could have applied to the Second Temple period, the rebuilding of the temple, but no, it does not. It does not fit. Too many elements do not fit what happened at that time. It could have happened, but since the Jews who returned from exile also failed God in some ways, so it never got built. It might be something that will be built to usher in the final kingdom of God on this earth before the final events are done. Or it might be a vision of the new reality of the new creation that we have in the future. The point is, we will have a look. I've got some diagrams to show you what the vision shows. But more than that, and I will show you the parallels to the New Jerusalem vision in Revelation. But other than that, we don't know. Was this supposed to be a real thing that would have happened, or is it supposed to just remain a conundrum, an unfulfilled prophecy? What it does do, though, is allow us to recognize that not all prophecies in the Bible were meant to be fulfilled literally, that maybe some of them could not be fulfilled based on changing circumstances as well. And so, something to think about. If you have time, start reading the book of Ezekiel. Never mind if your head swims around and you get lost in the material. We will try and sort that out as we go through the studies. And because of this special connection with Revelation, I need to let you know the approach that I will adopt in this series. Now, this series will probably go into December. We'll try and stop before the December break happens and try and complete it by then. And the approach here is what I call intertextual approach, but specifically between Ezekiel and Revelation. We will see all along the way, at every point, wherever this happens, how Ezekiel informs Revelation, how it provides materials, symbols, thoughts, and so on which Revelation is built. My contention is that the better we understand Ezekiel, the better we will understand Revelation as well, and vice versa. These two books, they're not twins, but neither are Daniel and Revelation, even though sometimes they are treated as if they are twins. But these two books are more like fraternal twins, Revelation and Ezekiel. And so we cannot study Ezekiel in a vacuum, like a book that stands by itself and we don't need the other books to understand. This one we do. And Revelation is where we need to do that. And so that's the approach that I will take. Next week, we will look at the vision Ezekiel had of God, or rather God's throne room, which then resulted in his own call and commissioning. And that occupies the first 3 chapters. So if you have time between now and next Friday, read Ezekiel 1 to 3, chapters 1, 2, and 3. Read it in as many different English versions as you can find. Use Bible Gateway, because you'd be surprised at what comes up. In terms of understanding what the Hebrew might be doing, then I suggest the NLT or the NET versions. In terms of proximity to the Hebrew and a bit more careful translation, I would suggest HCSB and RSV and so on. Okay, so try reading those 3 chapters. This is the grandest vision about God's throne room anywhere in the Bible. There are only a few of them, but the most extended, the most detailed, the most fanciful one is the one that we find in Ezekiel. And so we need to have a look at that. All right, so we will continue and get into the book itself next week with all this background material behind us. And for those of you who would like to make contributions to this ministry, there's the bank account for you to do transfer. This time I had something very unusual. Somebody yesterday somebody from this group transferred some donation before we started this series. And I was like, that is so nice. It's very unusual, but it was nice thought to see somebody thinking ahead for the series. So that's a bit of the background of Ezekiel. We will be challenged as we go through. We also have, I think we have one new, one new attendee tonight. She disappeared again. Judy's friend. Okay, I saw her for a while. All right, let me stop the recording